Happy Sabbath.
Good morning, happy Sabbath.
So this is a continuation of what we did last week. So I'm going to just start with a recap first and just get us all on the same page from where we were. Some of us weren't here last week, and I'm sure we all need a refresher anyway. So we spoke about several issues last week leading up to where we want to be this week, and we began with the issue of conservatism, and we sort of gave it we set it in its right framework and gave it a definition. And what we said was basically this. We said that when we come to the issue of conservatism, there are two main points that we can look at. And the first is where it originates as a word, I guess. It's etymology, which brings us to the French Revolution. And we talked about how the people before, you had the French Revolution, and the French Revolution, as we said, was to take out the monarchy and the rule of kings and popes and the way they were working together, and that divine right to rule that we had spoken about. And that was basically the political system of the 1260. And we said that during the 1260 you have this political system, but then the French, during the French Revolution, are going to overturn that, just like the Americans did a few years prior. And we're looking at the year, we said 1789, we'll just put that as our base. And French Revolution was what it was. It overtook that system. But then you have a group of people, these conservatives, in the year 1815, if I'm remembering correct, 1815, and they want to restore the monarchy. And we said that this is the first use of the word conservatism, going back to trying to conserve these values of divine right to rule, to restore the monarchy. So it's idea of conserving something in opposition to something else. And that's something I want to emphasize, is the idea that you can't be a conservative unless the idea you're trying to hold on to is under threat. Otherwise, you're just maintaining what is already there and what's not under attack. But you're a conservative when it's under attack and when change is possible. So here we have the change with the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, those ideas, the rights of the people, in contrast to the monarchy, and they want to hold on to what they have known thus far. And we also said another example of this, we said, was the issue of Lucifer. We said that before the announcement of Christ's position in heaven, and that announcement that was made, the angels had a understanding, and they had a misunderstanding, and they were in darkness. They were in ignorance, as we said. And we said that ignorance is synonymous with darkness, and God winks at that ignorance for a time. But once He brings the light, once this announcement takes place, then He sets everything in its proper order, and this is where we see the rebellion of Lucifer go into overdrive and continue, when now he has all the correct information. He should just let it go. He should just understand. But what he wants to do is he's going to stand right over here, and he's going to say, after this announcement, I want to go back to what I had previously known before. That Christ and I were equal, that I had this position, because now I feel as though I've lost all my liberty with this new king over me. So we saw that. We spoke about that a bit, so we're not going to go back into that, just to remind us of those things. So we identified conservatism as holding on to something, holding on to an idea or an action from a previous dispensation in a time of ignorance into a time of enlightenment or light, when you now have that information made readily available. So for the French, that the conservatism was to hold on to the monarchy. For Lucifer, it was to hold on to a misunderstanding of the hierarchy in heaven. So that was what we said was that definition, and then we went from there, and we spoke about our line and brought it to an application. And we said that when you look at our line, there are several dispensations. We have 1989, 9/11, 2014, I'm just going to do it quickly, 1921. So we said that these are the dispensations we see in our history, and they are all modeled after this first dispensation here from 1989 to 9/11, where you have an increase of knowledge, and then a formalization, and then a test or a door here, where that dispensation is going to end. And we said that each one of these can be seen in that same way, so we can bring two waymarks to each of these. And we see that in each history there's a different test that's being brought to bear. In this history it's line upon line. In this history it's the issue of time. In this history it's two streams. And we have a question mark here for this next one, the one we're in, because we're still in our increase of knowledge. And I'm sure we'll talk about that at some time soon. So in each one of these histories, you see this pattern take place of an increase of knowledge and a formalization, and then you're tested by that knowledge or by that formalization. And we said that you can break each one of these up and stack them upon each other. And I'm not going to write out all the labels. I'll just do one or two of them. Actually I will. 89, 11, 11, 14, 14, 19, 19, 21. Okay, so we have this, and we said you can stack these, and in this first one we see an issue of darkness. We said that before the time of the end, which would be here at 89, you're in darkness, and then you have your increase of knowledge, and then it's formalized. Now, what we don't want to do, and this is what we focused on last week, was the idea that when you have this increase of knowledge, if there is an increase of knowledge, it means that you must have been in darkness before that point. And that's not something we think about often, but it's an important point, because what we realize is that in the context of each one of these dispensations, our understanding is limited. And in some cases it's wrong.
Can you put the computer down?
Yes. So our understanding is either limited or wrong about the topic that our increase of knowledge is going to be given on. And before that point, you're in ignorance, you're in darkness. And I'll just put a D for darkness. So before 1989, before the issue of line upon line comes, you're in ignorance, you're in darkness upon it. The church didn't know, nobody knew how to do line upon line properly. And then that light comes, and now you're going to be tested by that. Same thing for time here with 9/11. The issue of time is going to come, and then you're going to be tested by that information. 2014 comes, and you have the issue of two streams. The issue of two streams comes, conservatism and liberalism, and we were in ignorance, in darkness before that point, and part of that is equality, part of it is racism, sexism, homophobia is another thing we've been talking about recently, and all of these things play into this time period here with two streams of information of which we were ignorant beforehand. And then the same thing for whatever our topic here is from 19 to 21. We were in ignorance on it, and maybe still in this moment while it's being fleshed out, because that is what our information is, the information God is giving us. So what we see is that at a fractal scale, we can see this pattern take place, and we see that each dispensation there is an increase of knowledge. And as we said before, based upon these, when that new piece of information comes here, and you start to hear about it and digest it and learn about it, and then it gets formalized, that's the test of conservatism at this point. Whether or not you're going to cling to the darkness here, so the darkness for this first dispensation would be a misunderstanding upon line. Are you going to hold on to the misunderstanding you had here, or are you going to increase with the light and accept the light and allow that light to mold your understanding, and in this case, to mold your methodology that you're using. And that test comes in each one of these histories. So you're either going to be a conservative and hold on to this darkness, or you're going to be a liberal and you're going to progress with that increase of knowledge. So that's the definition of conservatism and liberalism that I want to use, and I think it solves a lot of the issues related to the more common uses of liberal and conservative. And if we stayed with the definition like this, it sort of encompasses all the correct things. So in this framework of using conservatism in a dispensational way, conservatism and liberalism, conservatism can never be good and liberalism can never be bad based upon that definition, because it's always good to increase with the light and it's always bad to not increase with the light. Does that make sense?
Amen.
So it's just a different take on that definition. Very simple, but I think it makes sense for this. And it will be important as we go forward. So we can see this fractal, that we can take each one of these and show that, but we can also take it as a large scale, of which we're all familiar with. But one thing that Elder Jeff used to talk about a lot, at least in some degree, and we haven't talked about it for a while, but this here highlights it, and it's this idea. Oftentimes, when we think of the increase of knowledge, we say that the increase of knowledge just goes to the formalization. That everything ends there, that's the increase of knowledge for that line, and in some ways that's true, depending on what point you want to make. But really, what this shows us, and what we can see, is that this increase of knowledge doesn't stop at the formalization. It actually continues all the way through till the end of the line. So for us here, it would be the second coming. So this increase of knowledge is going to increase the entire time. And if we laid all these out, you would just see that all these dispensations, if we just plugged them in along this line, you would see that you have an increase of knowledge in every dispensation, and your knowledge is increasing, and it means that you are being constantly tested by your misunderstandings. And what I want to emphasize as well is that every issue that you're going to face on this reform line, every issue, whether it be line upon line, time, two streams, or whatever else we go from 2019 to 2021 and further, is not a new problem. It's a problem that you've had and that the movement has had from the beginning, because all of these misconceptions, when you take them from this perspective, are just the sins of darkness. They're misunderstandings of the darkness. So they come, all of these misconceptions are the pre-1989 darkness. Does that make sense? So it all comes back to this point. For instance, we could take line upon line, time's a really easy one. We know, obviously, that the church's position on time is that time is no longer. They read those quotes that way. The way that we as a movement used to read those quotes up until we hit the dispensation where we are going to be corrected on that issue. Same thing for two streams of information, same things for line upon line, and so on and so forth. All of these are not new issues. They're issues that were embedded in a pre-1989 mindset. So what God is doing is He's saying, I have a person, and this person here is the movement. I have this person here, and I need to get them to this point, the end of the line. But I can't say everything at the beginning because they're not going to be ready for it. You know, if in 1989, let's say we were all present and we got a little brochure for what the movement stood for, and it said, line upon line as we understand it today, we believe that you can set time, we believe this notion of two streams of information, so on and so forth. If you got that brochure, no one would have joined the movement. Because we all had those misconceptions, and God needed to slowly but surely deal with them one at a time, until we got to the point to where we could accept them. And even these issues that we're seeing here have been gut punches to all of us. You know, they've always been hard for us. Every single time we walk into a new dispensation, we hear what the present truth is for that dispensation. It's like individually we all go into crisis mode. We're all getting hit by it. we're all saying, is this really the thing? Can you prove it? How do you show this? It goes against everything I believed up into this moment. And this pattern is going to only repeat as we go down this line further and further. And it just shows us that our position on things is never fixed. Because you don't know what your misconception is versus what the truth is, because maybe God just hasn't shown it to you yet, whatever the truth of the matter may be. And it also shows you that the light is ever advancing, and we need to be moving with the light. We need to be following the advancing light, as we have always said, keeping up with the advancing light. And that this increase of knowledge goes all the way through the reform light. So now that we have plugged that in, and we've just recapped what we spoke about last week very briefly, I want to look at the history of the end of ancient Israel. So we're going to be looking at the time period of Christ and the disciples and all of that. So to begin, we're just going to recap what we already know about the line, about the reform line, before we start getting into some of the details about it, just to get us all on the same page. So when we look at the history of Christ, we know that it begins, its time of the end is in 4 BC. The birth of Christ and also the birth of John. Both are born here. Both the messengers, the first and the second angel, are born in this history. Then we know that we come to, actually there's one more thing I need to say, but let me just draw this. So you have 27 here, 27 AD. This is the baptism. And this for us would be 9/11. So there's one more thing I forgot to mention about our review. Not a huge point, but just to add it, because we did speak about it. We said that there are 2 reform lines of Christ. The one that we're about to do right here, and there's another one. And we said that this other line, let me say that a little bit better. So we said you have these 2 lines, and you have one line that deals with the history from his birth, then he's 12 years old, and then he is 30 years old here. So you have this history, and it's broken down into 12 and 18, and we know that that is the history for us from 1989, 9/11, and 2019. And then he goes into the wilderness. So this is the line that we spoke about last week, and we said that there's this line, and there's the line that we're going to do, and this line is a broader overview. And let me just finish this one, and then we'll talk about the differences and why those are important. So then you have 27, then you have 2014. This is the death of John. Sorry, let's say that differently. Yeah, we'll see 2014. I don't know a date for that. 2014 is when we mark there. Then we mark the issue of the cross. And for the cross, we say this is 2019. And then we have Pentecost here. And this is 2021. We're going to talk about that today. So there's these 2 lines. In this line we can extend further and we can look at it a different way, but we see these 2 different lines, and we said that both of them deal with Christ, but the problem we've had with these 2 lines is how we label these 2 lines. We said that there's an issue of labeling in the movement in accuracy. And we said that on this top reform line here, Christ is going to die at this waymark. And he's going to only remain just a little bit while longer, till his ascension. For 40 days he's going to stay with them, and then he's never going to return to earth until the second coming. So we said that this line, this top line here, that can extend all the way down to 100 AD with the death of John, if we were to continue it, but we're not going to, is dealing with a big picture. The big picture of the transition from the Jewish church to the Christian church and all the different players involved in that, the disciples, Christ, John, the Gentiles, the Jews, all of these things. So for us to call this the line of Christ would be inaccurate, because this line only deals with Christ for but a moment of time. Actually, a short period of time if you deal with the whole Reform line as a big picture. It's just this small period of time that is going to deal with Christ. And he is only in that line the second angel. But we said in this line here, it takes the life of Christ and it expands it and makes it a broader picture. And we said this would be more accurately the line of Christ, while this line would be more accurately something what we have always referred to it as, and is more accurate than calling it the line of Christ, is the end of ancient Israel. It's a bit of a mouthful, but right now it's the best label. We have the most accurate label, but to call it the line of Christ would be inaccurate. So we just wanted to frame it that way, because as we deal with this line, the role of Christ is going to be different than on this line here. We're going to deal with that in a moment. So let's get back to this line up here, and we'll start talking about that. Again, that was just a review point from last week, just to remind us. Okay, so on this reform line, this line of ancient Israel, we have the birth of Christ, the baptism of Christ, time of the end 9/11. 2014 is the death of John. And then we have the cross, 2019. So then we have Pentecost here. In this line, one thing that we see, and again, this is only just a small portion of this line. Again, it can go all the way down to the Sunday law and so on, and close of probation and all those things we could get. That would be over here. But we're highlighting here on the history in this line regarding to the priests, because that's what we're presently in, that dispensation presently. So if we look at this line, we know that the first and second angel, John and Christ, have a role to play here. And we know that Elder Jeff is typified by John the Baptist, and Christ is typified by Elder Parmenter is typified by Christ in terms of their role and the place they have on this line, this reform line. So we see that this transition point from the first to the second angel is here in 2014. So on this side, you have John. You have John on this side of the line, and you have Christ on this side of the line. Now, one thing we could talk about and mention is that there's an overlap in these two messengers, because John and Christ are both present at the time of the end. They're both present at the baptism, but at this point, if we did it this way, if you could see it, if this is 9/11, and this is 9/11, and this is, we'll say, 2014, one of their roles, the role of Christ, is slowly increasing, and the role of John is slowly decreasing. Does that make sense? One's going up and one's going down, ascending and descending, but it takes time. So even though this is the arrival of the second angel at 9/11, Christ is now going to be on the line in that kind of way, and begin to do a work from his baptism here. He's still not the star figure at that moment. He is, but there's this overlap taking place. There's this transfer of power, this influence that is taking place between the two of them. And Elder Tess and Elder Parmenter have talked about that extensively, and just for sake of time, we're not going to get into that a lot here on our reform line, what we want to touch on today. But we can see one is descending and one is ascending, John and Christ. Now, when we look at John has misconceptions. And John, in a large part, John has a lot of misconceptions when it comes to his own reform line. Now, what are John's misconceptions? What is the problem he has? What's the main problem he has? There's several problems, but he has one main one. What? He is expecting an earthly kingdom. Now, Who else was expecting an earthly kingdom at that time?
All the Jews.
The disciples?
All the Jews.
All the Jews. Everyone was. There was no one who was expecting a spiritual kingdom at that time. So if we were here and we said this is our time of the end, our pre-1989 for Christ, and John and Christ are now born. Now, just let's say John is old at this point and he has an opinion. At this period before, everyone has a misconception and they expect a literal kingdom. Nobody is safe from that misconception. Not John and not the disciples. The only one who's safe from that misconception is Christ. And that information isn't going to be given to God's people till later on the line. So up until here, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, that message of the literal kingdom is not dealt with till later. So for a long period of time, you have this misconception, this big misconception about the literal expectation that the Jews and the disciples have. And John. And that's important for us to note because one of the things we spoke about last week that we have to juggle on this line is the fact that John, let me say it differently. On this reform line, the movement, on the line, the movement is perfect. We know that. We know that at every step, knowledge increases. At every step, there is perfection of the plant, if we want to say it that way, if we want to use the agricultural model. It's always perfect. But the problem is that at the same time, while we can see perfection run from beginning to the end of the movement, there's also the issue of humanity. The issue of the fact that as human beings, we have many misconceptions, and we can show these. This is the perfect line for it with the line of Christ. We can show these misconceptions from beginning to end. And that from the beginning of the history all the way to the end, there's these misconceptions that run its way through, and God has to deal with that. So there's a problem of, when you talk about the perfection of the movement, it does not mean that everyone in this room has a perfect understanding of truth. It just means that whatever the truth God is giving us here at the end of the world is perfect. Whether or not you conceptualize it, whether or not you realize it and accept it, that is a personal problem. That is something personal that you have to deal with. But on the large scale picture of what God has given to the movement, that truth is always perfect. And it's how we relate to it where these problems begin. And that's what we saw here. That's what we see here. Pretty obviously that it's the individuals that have the misconceptions, and it's God who's giving the increases of light. Now, in this line, we have, as we just said, we have these misconceptions running the way through, and we have John, the Jews, and the disciples. So, who did we say John was? We said this is the first angel. So the first angel has a problem. Who are the Jews? In application, let's say it that way. In application, who would the Jewish church represent today? Adventism. So this would be the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And who are the disciples?
Priests.
What?
Priests.
The priests. Or we can say the individuals in the movement. We'll just say individuals. Or we'll say priests, that'll be fine. These three groups have this same misconception that John has. There's no difference between the three of them. The only difference is the willingness that John and the disciples have to be open to truth and to hear the truth and to see the change that needs to take place at this time. And that is what John and the disciples both have correct, is that they understand the time in which they're living, though they have misconceptions about that time. So that's something important for us to note as we as we're looking at this line. And as we go further, John is going to have that misconception, so is the disciples and so are the Jews, and it's not till we said here, at this point, where the first angel's influence ends, that you now have those misconceptions to begin to be dealt with. And we know that in 2014, this is the transition from Elder Jeff to Elder Parmenter. Here at that point. And that transition is taking place. We have the first going to the second. Now, I want to make one more point before we continue going further. And basically what I'm trying to show you, there's a lot of information we could talk about on this line that I'm skipping, but what I want us to see is that this reform line, this line of Christ, or this line of ancient Israel rather, is identifying for us here at the end of the world that the movement struggles with an increase of knowledge from the beginning of its history all the way to its end. So that's the focus that I'm looking at here at this point as we're going through it. I'm not focusing on all the transitions between the first and the second and all the problems with the first or the changes of the second. And there's a lot of things we could talk about on this. And I just want to hit that one point just for time. So you have the first angel going to the second angel. And we see this broader picture. Oh, that's what I was going to say, sorry. That's what I was leading up to. I want to mention this one thing about this reform line. Now, when we look at this reform line, what makes the reform line of the end of ancient Israel, this one that we're looking at, special versus all other reform lines that we've ever looked at? Does anyone know? What's the difference about this reform line?
Success.
It's a history of success, and why is that important?
It's our line.
It's our line. So when we look at history of successes, how many lines of success are there? Just two. There's just this line that we're looking at and our reform line today. So initially, one of the most important things we see is it's an issue of success. So I'm gonna put that over here. So it's a history of success. What else is different about this reform line versus all other reform lines? Not just that it's a history of success. What else?
Did you say that one, this line doesn't fail?
That is the history of the success. That's what we're looking at. That's the one we have marked. What else do we see?
Omega.
So what is featured on this reform line that you don't see anywhere else?
Three groups.
What?
Three groups.
3 groups. We have 3 groups. So in the history we're dealing with here of ancient Israel, we have the church, or we'll do it in order. We have the disciples, the movement. We have the Jews, and then we have the Gentiles. Now that we have these 3 groups that Brother Nathan is talking about, it leads us to the next one. What is important about the 2 groups versus the 3rd group? What are the 2 groups composed of? The first 2 groups. The church. It's 2 groups within the church. And what is the 3rd group? Outside of the church. Different. So for us today, we would say priests, Levites, and Nethinims, and we would say the priests and the Levites are both Adventists, but the Nethinims are a different group. What happens to that 3rd group? Either the Nethinims in our history or the Gentiles in their history? Where do they go? They're going to come in. So if you think about it, there's no other line in biblical history that features an ingathering of Gentiles other than the line of Christ and ours. They're the only 2. So there we're going to say an ingathering of Gentiles. So one issue that has come up in the last 6-7 months or so is the issue of how we deal with Gentiles. Now, what they need to do, what they don't need to do, what we expect from them, what they need to know. Now, when you start looking at that, what should be important for us to know is that, as we're saying here, there's only one other reform line that actually deals with Gentiles coming into the movement. And we're saying that's this reform line we're dealing with here, though we're not going to look at it at all because we're going to end at Pentecost. But it's just important for us to talk about presently, just so we can understand the specialness of this line. This line is the only other line of success, the only other line with 3 groups, and it's the only one with an ingathering. So when we look at it, if we want to know what it looks like to have Gentiles come into the movement, look at the line of Christ. That's how you figure that out. That should be our model about how we deal with Jews, or how we deal with that third group coming into the message. So I just want to put that there, tack that on there, that thought. It's an important point we're not going to look at today at all, but it's an important point because what is really interesting about this ingathering, when you look at this line, this reform line, is that was it easy for the Jews to, or for the Gentiles to come into the movement in that history? Was it easy, hard? Were there problems, or did it run smoothly? There were big problems. There were a lot of problems when you had the Gentiles coming into the church, coming into the movement rather, this movement here. They had issues about what the Gentiles needed to do. They had a whole Jerusalem council, shook the entire movement in that history about what the Gentiles were required to do. Did they have, in that history, the question was, did they have to be circumcised? And what restrictions they had to follow. So if we see that in that dispensation, in this only other line that is most perfectly our line, we should expect the same issues today in our reform line. That there will be controversy over how we deal with the Gentiles coming into the movement. Also, when you look at that, when you look at the Gentiles, the problem was that it was the disciples and it was the other Jews who were more conservative, in terms of conservative how we defined here, willing to accept light, than were the Gentiles. And Sister White has some really interesting quotes about that it were the Jews that were slow to progress with the light because they thought that in bringing the Gentiles into their movement, that they were going to lose what made them special as a people. They were going to lose the ceremonial system. They were going to lose the peculiarity of their club, which was the Jewish church. So all of those things can be factored in when we start looking at our reform line, and we're not going to deal with that today, but that could be something we could look at later. Like I said, we're going to only go to Pentecost. So that is important for us to know as well, looking here. So what I want us to see, and what I want to burn into our memories, is the idea that the reform line of the end of ancient Israel is the only other reform line that we have ever looked at, the only other history of time that perfectly reflects our own. So if you want to know what it's going to look like now, look at what it looked like then. And one of the main things we see in that reform line is this issue here of misconceptions. The issue that God's people don't fully understand the intricacies of the perfect truth that God has given them, and it causes problems. And that problem persists for a long time. Now, I would suggest that from 4 BC all the way to Pentecost is not about Christ, and it's not about John. It's about the disciples. Because the disciples are the only ones who are going to be here from the beginning to this point here. Christ is going to go, John's going to die. They're the only ones, and they're the focus of the efforts that Christ, John, and God are focused on, trying to get the disciples ready. Why? Why does he have to get them ready?
They have work to do.
They have a work to do, and their work begins right here at Pentecost. That's where they're first going to come in contact with these other people in a marked manner. So once we have that in our mind, we can understand how this reform line affects our own. And as we already all know, that our reform line here is a preparatory line. It's preparing us for the work that begins at our Pentecost, at our 2021, where we're going to now go to the next group of people. So one of the things you see, and for sake of time, I'm going to speed up because we really want to deal with this history from the cross to Pentecost, but I'm just trying to get us there. Like I said, I've skipped over a lot. There's a lot of information we could pack in from 4 BC to the cross. But again, all we want to see presently is that there's a misconception. Now I want to talk about that misconception just a little bit. The presence of that misconception, or misconceptions. Now, we said that John has a misconception, and it's the same one that these people have here, the Jews and the disciples. They all have this problem. Is the misconception that the disciples have, who represent the individuals in this movement, Does that end at the cross, those misconceptions? Does the misconception about the issue of geography end there? About the literal kingdom versus the spiritual one? Yes, no? Anyone know?
Exit again.
Forget about the application. Think about the history. Did they have a misconception after that point?
After which point?
After the cross?
Yeah.
Yes.
Terrible.
They have the identical misconception the day after the cross that they had the day before the cross. Nothing has changed. What has changed from this point to this point? From the day before the cross to the day after the cross, what has changed? Their attitude, their mood. They're really sad today, on this day, on this side of the line. They were happy on this side because they were with Christ. He was there. It was a normal day. The next day, they're distraught because everything seems to be falling apart around them. And they're disappointed because of they misunderstood that Christ was going to have to die. Now, even if they knew that, it would still be extremely disappointing and sad, but it's even compounded further because they didn't realize that it had to happen. So this is a tumultuous time for them, but what I want us to see is that their understanding didn't change the day before to the day after. They still had the same problem, the same misconception. And what I want to do is I'm going to extend this history, or not extend it, but just make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So after the cross, you have these disciples distraught. What do? What? I can't hear you, sorry.
Scatter.
They're scattered. They're scattered, they're disappointed, and not only are they going to scatter, but as part of the scattering, they're going to hide. They're literally going to hide away from everyone for a time. And why are they hiding? Just historically. Persecution. They don't want to be persecuted like Christ was. So they're trying to hide themselves. So they're disappointed, they're in fear of persecution. It's a bad day for them, the day after the cross, for all of these disciples. Now, jump forward to the resurrection. What happens? You have the resurrection, and these... What's the best way to... So you have the resurrection, and they're still disappointed. They still have these misunderstandings. They still are fearing persecution, only a couple days later. And the resurrection happens, and you're going to have God, or Christ at that point, slowly begin to deal with that problem. Now, what I want to do is I want to take the pattern here, and I want to bring it to over here. So the first thing we should see is a time of the end, or a point where information is now going to be present. So we're going to say that this is going to be given at this point, whether or not people know it. And we're going to say this is the cross. This is our time of the end. I'm not going to write it there so I don't confuse everyone. But what is the next thing we should see after that? We have our time of the end and what arrives, information, and what happens to that information? It increases. You have an increase of knowledge. So you have an increase of knowledge. How does this increase? Now what we want to look at now is how this increase of knowledge looks from the cross to Pentecost. Now, we know the problem they have is that they have these misconceptions. They didn't expect Christ to die. They didn't expect what happened. They have a misunderstanding about the literal versus the spiritual. All of these problems and more. They have issues with the Gentiles, all those things. So what is the first place that Christ begins to deal with those misconceptions? Anyone know? What?
The road to Emmaus.
Road to Emmaus. So the first thing we see is the road to Emmaus. I'm going to put RE. Now we're going to put several different events in here just to illustrate this increase of knowledge. And at the road to Emmaus, this is the first time Christ is going to begin to unfold to them the misunderstandings that they have. He has these two disciples, and we could read some quotes, and maybe I will just so we can see it clearly. we're running out of time. So I'll just say it briefly. I'm not going to read any of these. We just don't have the time for it. So in Desire of Ages, in the chapters discussing after the cross, what we see is that these disciples, they're walking on the road to Emmaus, and they are talking about Christ. Now, how are they talking about Christ? Do they understand what has happened? No. They're talking in a confused way amongst themselves. They're saying, what just happened? Literally a couple days ago, 2 days ago, what had just happened? And Christ comes up to them, and they begin to enter into dialogue and start talking about, they start explaining, the situation, and then Christ is going to slowly reveal himself to them by going into this deep prophetic understanding about what had just happened, explaining who Christ was from the Old Testament, showing them that all these things had to happen, and they slowly begin to realize all the way till they get to Emmaus, they get to the point they're traveling to, or they get to the, where they're going to lodge for the evening. And it finally dawns on them that we get it. Okay, that was Christ we were just talking to, and we have this increase of knowledge, if I can just say it so bluntly. They had a misunderstanding about who Christ was and that he had resurrected, and they didn't understand that Christ even had to die, but now he explains it to these two disciples. And then the two disciples run back home. They get back to Jerusalem in the middle of the night, and where do they go? What? The other disciples. Where are the other disciples at this point? They're in the upper room. So they run back to the upper room, and can they get in? What do they do when they get to the upper room? Do they just walk in the door? No. Why? Why can't they walk in the door?
It's locked.
It's locked. They had barred the door. The door is barred from entry at this point. They're trapped. They're in the upper room, and they've locked the door. So one, just on a very literal level, it shows you their mindset. They're terrified at this point. They've literally locked the door out. And they've locked the door, and they won't let these disciples in until they confirm their identities, and they're not here to get them. But there's a deep prophetic application to that thought, and I want you to consider it just for a moment. Now, what I want us to see, and we're not going to read the quotes for this, unfortunately, just for sake of time, but oftentimes when we think about the upper room, we really only think about it in the context of Pentecost. That they're going to spend 10 days in the upper room. Now, just for brevity, or just for clarity here, we know that this reform line can be broken up into two sections, or this dispensation from the cross to Pentecost can be broken up into two sections. The 40 days that Christ is with them till Christ descends, and then you have the 10 days in the upper room. So we have these 2 points here. So let's erase this just for a moment. So we have these 2 points. Now, for the 40 days Christ is going to spend with them, or let me say that differently, we're talking about the upper room. So when you come to the upper room, we only really think about these 10 days. But if you look at it, if you look carefully at this history, actually, the disciples were in the upper room from the cross all the way to Pentecost. Not all of them, but some of them, Sister White said, had taken temporary residence. And what did they do? They barred the door. They wouldn't let anyone in. So think about this with your spiritual glasses on. This whole history from the cross to Pentecost is the upper room, and nobody is allowed to come in. The door has been barred. Now, one thing that we can see if we look at this, one problem that becomes apparent is if we look at this history. And this is 19 to 21. And this is do it this way. This is 14. And this is the reform line of the priests. What is 14 to 19 for us in terms of the agricultural model? The latter rain. And then we have the latter rain, and 19 to 21 is the harvest. Okay, now let's look at the Levites for a second. So for the Levites, what is 19 to 21 for them?
Their latter rain.
It's their latter rain. Latter rain, and they're going to be harvested here.
Sunday law.
When do the Levites come into the message? When do they come in?
Starting panning.
What?
Starting panning.
Panem in 2021 here at this point. Now, we know here this is the COP, the close of probation for the priest. So a problem is created. And the problem is this. From 19 to 21, who comes into the movement? Levites or priests? Neither. Because all the priests that are going to be there are already there, and all the Levites who are going to come into the movement don't enter the movement at this point. They enter at this point here in 2021. So there's this gap of time from 2019 to 2021 where there's no one coming into the movement. Nobody new in a broader way. So nobody enters into the movement from 19 to 21 because you're at this point between priests and Levites, this transition point. So what is interesting is that this period of time is this history here we're looking at from the cross to Pentecost. So this could be the cross and this could be Pentecost. And what did we just say about the door to the upper room? It's barred, it's locked. So the movement from 19 to 21 has barred the upper room. Nobody's allowed to come in. Prophetically, nobody's allowed to come in. And we've barred the door, which I find really interesting because it directly relates to the experience that we have here, this problem of nobody coming into the movement. Do we see that? So the door is barred, if we could say it prophetically. And why is the door barred? Is the door barred because it has to be barred, or is it barred because the people who are inside that room aren't ready for people to come in? That's what it is. It's the people aren't ready. They're not ready to do their work because, like the disciples, they're fearful of persecution. They have these misunderstandings. They don't understand why Christ died. They're disappointed. They're scattered, as Brother Nathan was saying before. All of these things are taking place, and so the movement is not ready. And we're in this liminal phase where our prophetic upper room is barred from anyone entering. And you can find the quote about the upper room where she talks about the barring of the door. Desired Ages 802, paragraph 1, if you wanted to read that. It's a nice little spot she talks about there. So we continue in this, and as we said, there's this increase of knowledge, and we see the road to Emmaus. They have misunderstandings about who Christ is, his death, and they're going to get more information on that. The next thing we see is them in the upper room, but we're just going to attach that to the road to Emmaus. The next event we see is the Sea of Galilee, and I will just put SOG. The Sea of Galilee. Now, what is significant about the Sea of Galilee? And there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but this is where Christ is going to meet with Peter and others, and he's going to test Peter. Because remember, Peter had failed at the cross. He denied Christ 3 times, and now he has to atone for that by showing his love for Christ 3 times. And this is where Christ says, do you love me? 3 times, and he's going to show that he's been converted now. So we have that. Then we see here, we have the Great Commission. And all of these we could break down, and all of them we could read quotes for. I have quotes, I just can't talk about it. Now we have the Great Commission, and this is where the disciples really begin to realize the issue about whether or not, let me say it differently. This is where they're going to realize the fact that they're going to have to do this great work over here sometime soon. They don't know when it is, but they begin to realize, okay, there's actually something that we have to be doing, or that God is preparing us for, and it starts to make sense. Things are starting to click for them with the commission. And I'll just put COM for the Great Commission. So in each one of these waymarks, the Road to Emmaus, the Sea of Galilee, the Great Commission, Christ is slowly but surely increasing their knowledge little by little. And how is he teaching them? In what manner? What teaching method is he using? Parable teaching. So Christ is speaking to them in parables, but they still don't get it. They're standing there with Christ at the road to Emmaus, the Sea of Galilee, the Great Commission. But at all of these points, they still just don't get it. They're getting little glimpses, but it's all still foggy for them. And you can confirm this with what Ellen White says as well, if you look in the quotes. They're just not getting it yet, even though Christ is explaining it to them again. Now, what kind of message is Christ giving them? What information? Is this new or old information? It's old information. He's not going to give them a new message in this time period that he's with them. He's only going to tell them, basically, what happened back here. He just says, hey, you guys didn't get it back here, so I'm just going to give you another crash course for 40 days about what has just happened and why everything was supposed to happen the way it did. And that everything is within God's order. So they continue. So it's a old message that they're dealing with here. So for us, the message that we're going to receive, or we are receiving from 2019 to 2021, is not new information. It is an expounding or an expounding of and a re-examination of what has already been given us back in this history. So for us, generically, it's the issue of equality. So we didn't understand equality here, and now we're going to get a crash course again on it and a further expounding on it, so we can fully understand the intricacies of it before we get to this point of Pentecost, which shows you how important, one, the issue of equality is, and two, how many problems we have, because we are like the disciples here. Now, then we come to the point of the ascension. And so for the ascension, I just need to explain something. I'll just put ascension. Little arrow going up. So for the ascension, I want to explain something, because here, this is where the disciples have an increase of knowledge. At this point, Christ is going to, remember, they've spent 40 days with Christ, and he's given them all these parables, and like we said, they still don't understand it. But at the ascension, they're going to be standing there. They watch Christ go up into heaven, and what do? They just stand there. What are they waiting for? They're waiting for him to come back down. They're like, where'd he go? So they're waiting there, they're standing there, they have no idea what's going on or why he's left. And who comes? Angels. Angels come and they say, hey, why are you waiting here? Why are you looking for him to come? He's not going to return now, and when he does return, it's going to be in the manner in which you saw him leave. So they start to get it now. They have an increase of knowledge at this point. So the ascension is the increase of knowledge for this dispensation. Now, I've said the whole time that they've been having this increase of knowledge already with the road to Emmaus, the Sea of Galilee, the Great Commission, and all of that is true. And to illustrate that, I just want to look at the history from 1989 to 9/11 for just a moment. So, information arrives at 1989, and the increase of knowledge that takes place, probably can't see, the increase of knowledge that takes place is never a point in time. It's never just at one moment where you say, aha, I got it. What happens is you have to struggle with it, you have to wrestle with it. But we know that if we want to do this, and we want to say that there's an increase of knowledge and a formalization, what dates would we put for the increase of knowledge?
91.
What?
91.
91? 91, 92?
Yeah.
What would we say for the formalization?
96.
96. But the increase of knowledge isn't this fixed point where you see, in 91, 92, it wasn't there wasn't just a moment where Elder Jeff said, oh, I get it now. I in this vacuum. it was a period of time, it was a process that actually works through that waymark. The increase of knowledge, waymark, is just the prominent point of that process. Does that make sense? So the increase of knowledge is on either side of the waymark of the increase of knowledge of 91, 92. It happens all the way from 1989 to the formalization. So I want us to realize that, because I'm going to put the waymark here of increase of knowledge at the ascension, but really it's still on either side of it. So now the disciples have this message from the angels, they get something now, they have a little bit more information, and what's going to happen is they're going to spend 10 days in the upper room, and they're going to wait. And during this time, what are they doing? They're studying. They're going through the prophecies, looking at all these things, and preparing themselves for the day of Pentecost. Though, again, they don't know that Pentecost is the day. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. Maybe, and it's going to be spatially confusing. It could be. And so let me try to solve that issue for us. So, before we do that, let me just ask this question. We said that Christ is speaking to them in parables here, and they're studying here. He's speaking to them in parables while he's with them. They're studying while he's gone. But again, they still don't, everything hasn't clicked yet. They're close, and they have all these bits of information, but it all hasn't come together yet. When does it come together for them? What do they need for it to come together?
Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. And when is that?
Pentecost.
Pentecost. Now, one problem we have as a movement, and this is, everyone has this problem, whatever field you're looking at, is the issue of how we relate to a waymark. For the movement, that would be the problem for us. Pentecost, when you think Pentecost, Pentecost is a big day. A lot of stuff happens on the day of Pentecost. And there's two main points that happen on the day of Pentecost. What are the two main points? Think about it from this perspective. Let me ask this question. On the day of Pentecost, what two groups meet? The disciples and the Jews. Or the first and the second groups are going to meet together, right? That's when they're going to come together at that point. So, at Pentecost, there's two separate events, if I want to say. We can look at the day of Pentecost and we can actually expand it into looking at two different things. What's the first thing we see? It's the actual thing we think of when we think of Pentecost. It's the descent of the Holy Spirit. They're going to receive the Holy Spirit, and Sister White says, I'll just read it, it's a quick quote. On the day of Pentecost, this is Church Triumphant 76.1. When on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the disciples, and they understood the truths that Christ had spoken in parables. So here at Pentecost, the first thing that's going to happen is that they're going to receive the Holy Spirit, and they're going to get it now. They're going to understand parable teaching. They're going to understand everything Christ had said, because now their minds are unlocked to that information. So here, for them, when it clicks, and when they're ready, when they understand it, that's the formalization for them. When they get that, when they finally understand that information. But there's another event we said on the day of Pentecost, and it's when that second group of information comes and unites with them. It's when the harvest is going to take place on that day as well. So the first thing that happens on the day of Pentecost is the Holy Spirit descends, their knowledge is increased, their knowledge is formalized, and they understand everything that Christ had said, those parables. But the next thing that happens is that these Jews are going to, the 3,000 Jews are going to enter the movement, and that's the harvest point. So one point of Pentecost, you can see the formalization, but at another point on Pentecost, you can see the ingathering of the 3,000. Does that make sense? So we're taking one day, and we're expanding it and seeing two different events that happen. And so I hope it doesn't cause any spatial problems for anyone. But here, this is where the Holy Spirit descends, and this is where the ingathering of the Jews comes in. Now, as we said before, that problem that they have, that misunderstanding, does not get remedied until their formalization point here where the Holy Spirit descends. So they've had all these problems the whole time. And in fact, if we wanted to be honest about it, we could show that the issues aren't even going to be fully dealt with at the day of Pentecost, because there's a lot of things they still have to learn. But they understand enough for this moment here to get them through the work of Pentecost and get them through all the way till 34, where they're going to get to the Gentiles, and then there will be a whole other set of problems and issues that they have to work with. And if we had more time, we would go through and we could talk about the issues that the disciples have with the Gentiles. And that's something I think that is infinitely worthy of study, because again, we are the disciples, and the disciples had many issues in how they related to the Gentiles. They had prejudice. They didn't understand the work of the Gentiles. They didn't understand how to get them in and what needed to be done, what it was required of them. So many different problems they had in relationship to the Gentiles, and hopefully maybe in a future study we can look at that and look back at this history. But what I want us to see is that this misconception, the whole point of it was that this misconception has weaved itself, misconceptions in the plural, from the beginning of the Reform line all the way through the Reform line, and it's slowly through this line that Christ and God has been dealing with these issues. First, he's going to deal with the first big point of change or understanding is here at Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit descends. Now they understand parable teaching. They understand what they didn't understand all this time. And it's a little bit scary for us when you think about it, because really, Christ had been speaking to them in parables all this time before, and they got some of it, but they never got it in its fullest potential, in its full understanding. And it's only well after our close of probation that we're going to understand these things. All the way here at the formalization of this message, that we have our aha moment. And so what I'm trying to elaborate for us is the increase of knowledge that is taking place on this line. The idea that we have to be ready to follow the light wherever it goes, and we shouldn't be fixed in our understandings. We shouldn't hold on to the darkness and say, this is what I've always known, so it must be true. We have to be able to move with the advancing light. Because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves just like the issue that John had, or just like the Jews did, where they're unable to move forward, and they become fixed in that dispensation while the whole movement moves on without them. And so we're out of time. There's a lot more we can say, and maybe in a future study we'll continue that. If I do get another chance to present, I'll continue with all this. But this was just a brief overview about these misconceptions that we have and the way that we need to handle them, and the fact that the reform line here of ancient Israel, the end of ancient Israel, depicts our misconceptions, but it also is great comfort for us, because it says that Christ and God is going to work out the problem, and everything's going to be okay, even though we have these problems presently. Because really, we're right here in this history. You know, we're even before we haven't even received the full increase of knowledge. We don't even know what it is really, I guess, in a large part. But here, we're not even to the formalization where we understand anything. So we're still in the point where the disciples are scattered, they're disappointed, they don't understand what they're doing, where they are, and as we know, that's been many of our experiences as we've related to these things, and it's all foretold for us upon the line here, and Christ is working it out. Okay, so we're going to end there. Hope it makes sense. I'm sorry, some of it was a little bit rapid and I didn't get into all the details, but all right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day, this Holy Sabbath day that you've given us. We ask that you be with us now, that you would guide and protect us, that you would lead us to a further understanding, that you would increase our knowledge, Lord, in this dispensation, that we could be found worthy of the knowledge, Lord, that you would prove us and test us, that you would show us what is to come, Lord, and that you would heal our disappointments, heal our hurt and anguish, Lord, and that you would like the disciples, be patient and long-suffering, and that you would work with them and show us the things we need to do in order to get prepared for the coming ingathering of Jews and Gentiles. We ask for your blessing now. We pray that you would be with us throughout the rest of this day, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.